All right, guys. Today we're hitting chapter 10. This is the Jacksonian Era. So this is Unit 3. This is the third chapter of Unit 3. There's 4 we're covering. 8 was kind of an overview from 1800 to about 1850, 1860. Really more the first half of 1800s. Chapter 9 dug in a little bit deeper. And if you remember, we ended with Andrew Jackson beating John Quincy Adams for president in 1828. Okay, so Jackson's our president. They both ran in 1824, but there are a couple others running as well. One being Henry Clay. If you guys remember, that's when Henry Clay dropped out of the race when it went to the House because nobody had a clear majority. So it goes to the House. Henry Clay drops it. So Adams wins, and Henry Clay mysteriously becomes Secretary of State. Clearly, it was some backwoods or backdoor bargain agreement. And Andrew Jackson from 1824 to 1828, when John Quincy Adams was president, pretty much declared this was a corrupt bargain, as he called it, and pretty much pushed it on how corrupt John Quincy Adams was. And so he made John Quincy Adams a one-term president. Oftentimes, I know in my last lecture I rushed through the end of it, oftentimes that election, 1828, is compared to the election of 2016. In 1828, you have John Quincy Adams and Jackson, one scientific, very literate, very educated man, believed in a federal government, plenty of experience as Secretary of State, one of the most qualified people for the job, versus Jackson, who didn't have much experience at all, but he was seen as a guy who represented the common man. You know, Jackson was a farmer, lawyer, eventually a soldier. So the common man liked Jackson. And so oftentimes you fast forward to 2016, Hillary Clinton versus Trump, it's the same concept. It's almost eerie how similar those two were. So that's one comparison of many throughout history, as we always talk about how history repeats itself. But nonetheless, Andrew Jackson is president in 1828, and this is what we've come to. So this actual cartoon is pretty interesting because it shows how all creation coming to the house as if this is Noah's Ark. Trying to show that comparison from Jackson's White House to the to Noah's Ark, how people from all kinds of walks of life were welcome in the White House, because Andrew Jackson would actually throw a party as his first opening White House, which everybody has. They have a ball, but Jackson had a party, opened it up to everybody. Jackson's United States that he inherits is what it looks like. It's 24 states, 13 million people, growing rapidly. Many farmers are in debt. For his new land, more and more farmers are currently using credit to buy land. So many are in debt. Some of that comes from the National Bank that they grew to hate because of the last panic, 1819, that we talked about before, last chapter. Andrew Jackson, AJ here, when he gets into office, he considers everybody corrupt, and he thinks the best way to take care of this is to get rid of everybody in office. Before Jackson, you didn't change out your whole cabinet. It was very common for a president to come in and keep most, if not all, of his cabinet, especially if it's a similar political party. And in doing so, Jackson believed this created corruption. The longer you're in office, the more corrupt you would be. So he comes in there and gets rid of the whole cabinet, and puts people in charge, friends he could trust, allies he can trust. This might sound familiar. Not necessarily people who are qualified for the job, but people that he trusts or liked or that he owed favors to. This sounds familiar to modern times. It should be, right? They weren't the most qualified for the job. Again, can't stress that. And this is a phrase. It says, victors go the spoils. This is to the victor goes the spoils. I want you to remember that, because when you win, you get the spoils. You get everything. This would be called the spoil system. When you're going to, you create a system where you give all the appointments to your friends, allies, people who donate money for a campaign, people you can trust, but also people you owe favors to, right? So this is a spoil system, not based on merit. Merit is that concept that they deserved it, they earned it. It's not going to be based on that at all. Okay, now usually I don't do this, but I want to show you guys a video of essentially this website. This is this video of a cartoon version of Andrew Jackson, and this is historically accurate. So I'm going to stop here and actually show you this video.
Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, was a hard-partying, hard-fighting, hard-crazy, ugly son of a bitch who took the highest office in the land because he felt like it. And what were you gonna do, stop him? He'd like to see you try. When he wasn't busy shaping the presidency as we know it today, you could find Jackson out behind the White House dueling. The number of duels that he took part in varies depending on what source you consult. Some say 13, while others rank that number somewhere in the hundreds, both of which are entirely too many times for a reasonable human being to voluntarily stand in front of someone who is shooting at them. On one occasion, Jackson challenged a man named Charles Dickinson to a duel. The reason behind it wasn't important, not to us, and certainly not to Jackson. Jackson was even kind enough to give Dickinson the first volley. Dickinson happily obliged and shot Jackson, who proceeded to shake it off like a bee sting. When Jackson returned the favor, Dickinson wasn't so lucky, and that's why his face isn't on the 20. Andrew Old Hickory Jackson ran for president in 1828. If you're wondering how he got such a lame nickname, it's because he used to carry around a hickory cane and beat people senseless with it. And if you're wondering why he did that, it's because he was a fucking lunatic. Despite the best efforts of his opponents, the justice system, and whatever force balances the tenuous order of the universe, he succeeded. Jackson's first act in office was to throw a huge party, less of a civilized celebratory gala and more of a political Burning Man. More than 20,000 people showed up for his inaugural open White House, during which the crowd got so rowdy that Jackson himself was forced to sneak out a window. It wasn't until someone had the bright idea to place tubs of whiskey on the White House lawn that Jackson was able to sneak back into the House and actually start being president. Jackson's presidency wasn't all Animal House-style shenanigans, however. He was also the first president on whom an assassination attempt was made. It was Richard Lawrence III who, in a futile attempt to out-crazy Jackson, believed he was the rightful king of England and that murdering Jackson would secure his claim to the throne because, according to Lawrence, Jackson killed his father in 1832, even though Lawrence's father had never been to America and actually died in 1823. Either Jackson could kill through space and time, or Lawrence is simply the kind of crazy we just don't make anymore. He attacked Jackson while attending a funeral, brandishing 2 pistols, both of which misfired. Jackson then turned and calmly proceeded to beat Lawrence to near death with his cane until the president's aides pulled him off the would-be assassin. If you're thinking that Lawrence's guns misfired because he lubricated them with rabbit's blood or something else crazy, they were inspected afterwards and determined to be in perfect working order. We're pretty sure that the bullets, like everyone else, were just scared of Jackson. The legacies of many great men are measured by the words of profound wisdom they leave us. Andrew Jackson is no different. Upon reflection of his life and works, he was quoted as saying, "I have only 2 regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." That's right. In a life rich with national partying and spontaneous murder, Jackson's only regret was that he didn't kill quite enough people. People like Calhoun, who was Jackson's vice president.
So it's a pretty interesting video. It's historically accurate. Yes, opened the White House to everybody. Had a huge party, and literally they couldn't get people to leave because if they got somebody out, somebody else came in. It wasn't until they moved out, called outside, that they were able to lock the doors and keep people out. And it kind of describes the chaos of Andrew Jackson's presidency and the randomness and spontaneous choices he made. It really is perfect to describe his both terms, actually. He's not very logical in that sense, but nonetheless, this is the president that we have at the time. Now, one thing that is need to point out is you wouldn't think social issues would play a big role, but they actually do change literally the course of history in this case. You see, before I get to what's called the Eaton Affair, I failed to mention this in the election of 1828, but Andrew Jackson had a huge issue with what John Quincy Adams' campaign had said about him. It was a vicious campaign, just like every presidential campaign. And one thing that they had said about they attacked Andrew Jackson, was his wife. They called her adulteress, said he was living in sin. And technically, they were right because his wife had divorced her husband, moved to Tennessee, married Andrew Jackson, and they were living together. But it would turn out that the divorce was never finalized. So, by all legalities, yes, Andrew Jackson's wife was committing adulteress, was a adulteress, and they were doing so. But the vile and horrible things said about his wife, Andrew Jackson never forgot. even when she passed away. And Jackson never forgot the treatment she received from the press or from John Quincy Adams. Keeping that in the back of your head, keep that in mind. So this issue comes up for Andrew Jackson with his cabinet. His vice president is John C. Calhoun. All right, makes sense. They're both Southerners who both have Southern ideas about limiting federal government. Perfect together, right? Calhoun's wife refused to socialize with John Eden, who was a Secretary of War. Okay, refused to. Eden's wife, I'm sorry I put Easton on here, but Eden's wife had a past. Apparently, before her husband passed away, she did know Mr. Eden, John Eden, very well. And there were rumors that before he passed away that they were actually a thing. Like she was cheating on her husband before he actually passed away. Her husband owned a tavern and bar, so she was like a tavern lady. So if you're going to look at the social elites of D.C., like Vice President Calhoun's wife, she's going to think of herself up here. And Secretary of War, his wife, Miss Eden, is not seen as equal to her. So she kind of refused to socialize. She got everybody else in the cabinet, their wives, to do the same thing, mistreat Miss Eden. And Jackson was furious about this. At one point, he told Calhoun, put your wife in order, make sure they treat Miss Eden fairly, because he remembered how his wife was treated. He never forgot. But Calhoun was just like any other man, can't control his wife, right? She has a mind of her own, and they never let up on Miss Eden. It got so bad, John Eden actually will resign. And so this actually was a problem between Calhoun and Jackson. And Martin Van Buren, the Secretary of State, snuck in and he used it as a wedge to really split them apart and go in there and become his second-hand man. As a matter of fact, during his first term, this would drive such a wedge for Jackson. He wouldn't actually listen to his friends that he appointed anymore. He listened to Van Buren and others in his circle, not these other guys. So it actually plays a huge role in history, so much that Martin Van Buren, he becomes president, and he only got that far because of this. We'll talk more about him in a second. Internal improvements, as far as that goes with Jackson, he's against using any federal money to improve the conditions of just one state. So, example is a Maysville road bill. As you can see from the picture, it only benefits one state. That's it, Virginia. He didn't agree with it because federal money shouldn't help one state, so he vetoes this. He still funded interstate projects. He still thought it was okay. He still thought it was totally constitutional for the federal government to fund more than one state. And I say constitutional, that's just a back story. It's not necessarily the whole truth. Jackson did what he thought was right and wrong, not necessarily what he thought was constitutional. And you'll see that in a second. But he does veto the Maysville road bill. It's a perfect example of how he's going to use a veto rather quickly. And this is a point in time when presidents were reluctant to do so because it was an extreme use of your power. Jackson, throughout his presidency, would not be afraid of veto, so much that he became known as King Andrew. And you see from this cartoon, he's trampling on the Constitution of the United States. He's got the veto power in his hand. He's almost like he's acting like a king, just doing what he wants. And that's the the character he received from all his vetoes and how he attempted to control so much. He became King Andrew. Now, he has to face off with a guy named Calhoun, who is his vice president's first term, but it doesn't last very long. Calhoun had the belief, even as vice president, of nullification. And that was the ability of a state to declare a law passed by Congress unconstitutional. Therefore, it's null and void. That is nullification in a nutshell. He gets this idea all the way from the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions from way back when John Adams was president. He had passed the Alien Seditions Act, which was totally unconstitutional. But at that point in time, when Adams was president, the Supreme Court didn't decide what was constitutional and unconstitutional. Nobody did. So Kentucky and Virginia got together and declared those acts unconstitutional. Well, a few years later, enter John Marshall. John Marshall starts declaring things unconstitutional. That's the Supreme Court's job. We know that now. But Calhoun brings up this old theory and says, hey, states can still do this. He argues it's not only for the Supreme Court. States have a right to do this as well. This is John see Calhoun, I want you to think as him as like the leader of the South leaving the United States in 1860. He'll be dead when this happens, but his whole life pretty much sets up for this, and you understand that by the end of this chapter. You should, if not, then I failed. So there's already this debate from Calhoun. The states can defy federal law if they agree is unconstitutional. And this debate happens, really takes place, or the big overall point of this, the highest point of this comes with the the Webster and Hayne debate. Sorry. And it's the only time I talk about Daniel Webster in my lectures now. I've crossed him out quite a bit, but it's hard to cross him out for this. Robert Hayne is making this argument on debate floor. Eventually, this gets nullification, makes it to the Senate floor. These guys are in a huge debate. This is pushing the idea to civil war, because if a state can find a law null and void and refuse to follow it, and the federal government forces it, that's physically enforce it, you're going to have a war essentially, and the state's going to try to leave, and the federal government says, no, you can't just leave and do whatever you want. So this debate really points at, I have the text here at the bottom. Hayne makes a statement, says the federal government is an agent to the states. The federal government represents all the states. Webster says no. He says both the state and the federal government are agents for the people. So true sovereignty relies in the people as a whole. And he finishes by saying liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. So for you and me, in modern times, we don't get that pumped up about it. But imagine that taking place on the Senate floor, that declaration saying federal rights over state rights. You can imagine the tension in the air and how this was really sharpening the edge for Civil War. And this is so early on. Jackson's elected in 1832, and he's dealing with this in 1828. And he's already starting to deal with these issues towards the end of his first term as president. It's going down 1831, 1832, and 1833. All this is happening. Okay, so this whole nullification causes a rift with Calhoun. Essentially, people are waiting to see where Andrew Jackson stands on this. Andrew Jackson is pretty quiet until the annual Jefferson Day. Virginia has a day called Jefferson Day after Thomas Jefferson. He's passed away at this point. But at the dinner toast for Jefferson Day, where everybody's invited to like pretty fancy dinner to celebrate Jefferson's Day. And of course, Jackson is there. Jackson is Jefferson Part 2, like state rights. It's not like the federal government, like the farmer, common guy. He's a miniature version of Jefferson. That's the way I like to think of him. And Jackson holds a toast, says, let's have a toast. Looks at Calhoun, suppose looked at him square in the eye and says, our union, it must be preserved. With that statement, Jackson made it clear, federal government has authority. Federal government is more important. The government has to stay together. This is kind of crazy because Calhoun is your typical state rights guy, believes in state rights. But in this case, he recognized the issue. There's actually only been one president who has been state rights, and then when he became president, actually still agreed with that. Everybody else who became president eventually realized that we had to have the federal government. Jackson wasn't an idiot. He does a lot of stupid, crazy things, but he's not an idiot. Once he has that rift with Calhoun, Jackson will eventually remove all Calhoun's partisan friends, those that agree with him on politics, from the cabinet. He actually gets rid of his whole cabinet at one point. Calhoun will eventually resign as vice president towards the end of the first term, run for Senate in South Carolina, so he becomes senator in South Carolina. And that way he's going to be able to defend nullification on the Senate floor. So as VP, he can't do that much, but later on he becomes senator to do that. So the first term, his VP is Calhoun, but Calhoun knows he's not going to be picked for the VP for the second term, so he's going to go to the Senate floor. But before he goes to the Senate floor, he's still vice president. And sure enough, if you don't know this, technically the vice president is the head of the Senate. When he's not there, Senate majority steps in. In modern times, this guy's Mitch McConnell. I don't want to talk about how much I hate that guy. But nonetheless, Mitch McConnell technically is filling in for the vice president. the vice president actually can step in and make a tiebreaker vote for the Senate, which has happened plenty of times before. It happened a couple of years ago when they were trying to repeal Affordable Health Care Act. He can step in and try to make a tying vote. In that case, it was actually John McCain who refused to vote against it. But he has done it in other cases before. This is what the vice president does. It's actually technically his job, leader of the Senate. So Calhoun is leader of the Senate. Van Buren's going to resign as Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson puts him as ambassador. And you're thinking, why? Whoa, I thought Van Buren and Jackson were close. And they were, don't get me wrong. But the whole idea behind this is Van Buren is supposed to go become ambassador to England, spend some time in England, and come back and run for president when Jackson is done with his 2 terms. And this is actually pretty atypical even now. If you're in the spotlight, you really don't want to stay in the spotlight too much because you're always going to find something wrong. So it's a really good idea to be, say, Secretary of State for 4 years, call it quits, and 4 years later run for president. That's actually much better than trying to continue on and picking up where you left off. It's actually pretty difficult to do that. So that was the plan. Van Buren resign, go to England, be ambassador, come back 4 years, run for president. And that was the whole plan of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. But in order to be ambassador, you have to be approved by the Senate. So just like a Supreme Court justice, the president appoints the ambassador, Senate has to approve it. Calhoun stops. He blocks it from ever happening. He blocks the appointment, blocks the hearing altogether. And Calhoun says, as a leader of Senate, vice president can do this, he says, "It will kill him, sir, kill him dead." That's why he told a friend of his about Martin Van Buren. He says, his career is ruined. I got him. He's done. Little does Calhoun know that, guess who's going to be Jackson's vice president? Who's known as Little Magician, this guy with the huge chops on the side, bald head, huge chops. That's Martin Van Buren. First term, Calhoun is VP. He's going to resign and run for Senate of his home state of South Carolina. Jackson wasn't going to pick him anyways. And for a second term, Jackson will pick Van Buren, even though Van Buren wasn't supposed to be vice president. Okay. At this point in time, also there is another backstory that develops between Jackson and Calhoun. See, if you think back, remember how it was Calhoun who had sent Jackson, he was Secretary of War under Monroe. He sent Jackson to the border of Florida and told Jackson to not invade Florida, to not attack Spanish, to not attack anything inside Florida. If you remember, Jackson did just that. He chased after Seminoles, went into Florida, attacked them, attacked forts. He went after these Native Americans. At the time, Calhoun was so mad, Jackson disobeyed him. He actually wrote letters that Jackson should be kicked out of the military. He should dishonorable discharge. He should be condemned for this. He should go to prison for this. Jackson had done this, and Calhoun was so upset he had wrote these letters to other people. It never happened because what Jackson did in Florida actually helped John Quincy Adams. So Jackson didn't get in trouble for this all, even though he defied direct orders from Calhoun. So that happened way back in 1818, 1819. Okay. But Jackson never knew Calhoun said that stuff about him until now. So after trying to block his attempt to ambassador, Jackson's furious with Calhoun. They're already split on this state rights versus nullification issue, right? State rights nullification. Jackson's mad about that. Jackson is already mad at Calhoun from the Eaton affair, right? That started the whole thing. Then you have Jackson appointing Van Buren to ambassador to England and Calhoun blocking it. So Jackson's already pissed about this stuff. Jackson cannot stand Calhoun at this point. And then he uncovers these letters that Calhoun had planned to punish him for his acts in Florida and was stopped. So Andrew Jackson, his response to Calhoun when Calhoun wrote him a letter was, "Understanding you now, no further communication with you on this subject is necessary." Boom. Didn't sound too bad to us, but in reality, that pretty much is telling you, shut up, don't talk to me anymore. We've got nothing to say to each other. So you're thinking, okay, well, what's going on with Calhoun? Okay, so Calhoun is still pushing his nullification theory. Jackson is trying to smooth things over. The whole nullification, if you're thinking, all right, well, which law are they saying it's void? It's the tariffs. They're saying the tariffs that passed by Congress, unconstitutional. Says the Congress does not have the right to do that in the Constitution. And so South Carolina says we don't have to follow it. It's unconstitutional. Okay. Jackson actually tries to do a political thing here, and he tries to pacify those calling for nullification in South Carolina. He's going to lower the tariff. Okay, lowers a little bit, but cloth and iron are still high, but he's going to lower it, trying to give them something to take. Calhoun doesn't buy this, and you can almost think that Calhoun thinks he's got a lot of support. He's the one going back. Calhoun's going to South Carolina, telling them, get ready. The federal government's going to come in here and enforce these tariffs. They're going to send an army down here to make sure they do it. They're going to physically enforce these tariffs. That's the concept that Jackson is trying to tell the people Calhoun is telling everybody in South Carolina, his home state. Jackson never threatened to do that yet, but he's trying to get people scared and fear the federal government, fear these people trying to control them. Might sound a little familiar in modern times. He's spreading what essentially is a conspiracy theory. South Carolina government will refuse to allow federal tax collectors. They're going to say, hey, those tariffs are null and void. We're not going to let you in here. So now you're going to allow the federal authorities to collect tax. And this is when the election of 1832 is happening. Roughly, Calhoun's going to 1830. Calhoun's going to step down. He'll run for Senate, win become Senator of South Carolina, so he can argue this on the Senate floor and not be a vice president anymore. And then South Carolina governor takes it a step further. He calls for a volunteer state militia force of 10,000 men to protect the state from invasion from the federal government. This, if it sounds like civil war, that's exactly what this was. They were going to go to civil war or a tariff. Now you're like, oh, no. It's around they're going to war over state rights. The state's right to nullify and void that. And if you want to debate that, that's fine. It was a state right to collect a tariff it was a federal trying to collect a tariff, and they were doing ready to commit civil war on states' rights to nullify any law, right? So South Carolina has made their stand. They even called for a volunteer army force to get ready to protect South Carolina from the federal government. And you got to wonder, what's Andrew Jackson going to do now? This political cartoon was actually drawn in this time period to show that Andrew Jackson and the rats leaving a falling house. It's akin to the idea of a sinking ship. When rats, if a ship starts sinking, all the rats are swimming away. It's kind of the same idea here, that this cartoon is clearly sees Jackson's downfall as his friends are all running and leaving, including Calhoun, and it's going to be the end of things. All right, Jackson's response, though, typical Jackson form, he takes a firm response. He tells people in South Carolina, do not follow those false leaders. Without naming Calhoun directly, he says the laws of the U.S. must be executed. That's key here. He says executed. Those who told you that you might peaceably prevent their execution deceived you. Their object is disunion. Disunion by armed force is treason. There you have a hero of many people in the South, farmers and everything, state rights activists. You hear their leader, essentially Jackson, saying, this is treason. If you do this, this is treason. And it's funny because he also says the laws of the U.S. must be executed. And that's his job. Executive office is to execute those laws, right? Keep that in mind in a few more slides. His response, he's going to send federal soldiers and a warship to Charleston, South Carolina. It's one of the largest cities in South Carolina. He also will send a force bill to Congress, which pretty much asks Congress for authority for Jackson to use force to collect the tariff if necessary. Okay, so imagine that. It's like soldiers coming in and using force to get the money, the tax. Imagine what that would look like. He sends that force bill to Congress. South Carolina looks for help for other states, especially the southern ones who are big on state rights. And they all really look at South Carolina and they say, we feel sorry for you, but we're not going to war over a tariff. That doesn't really bother everybody else. Don't get me wrong, South hates the tariffs, but not enough to go to war. Not what South Carolina did. South Carolina, I've called on the butthole of America because of this. They're trying to start a war, and then all of a sudden they realize they've got no support for this. No matter how you argue it, only South Carolinians really believe that the federal government is going to come in and squash them. Jackson has made that clear that he's willing to do that now. If you don't listen to him, he's trying to play a middle part. He tried to lower the taxes. He's trying to hold on to it, trying to help you guys out, but you're not meeting him in the middle, and he's pretty furious. So now you have a standoff. You have Jackson ready to invade if he needs to. You have Calhoun of South Carolina, the senator now of South Carolina, standing his ground, and they're calling a militia up, but they don't have support. So now you have an issue like what's going to happen next? Who's going to push the next buttons? Enter Henry Clay. Again, I call him the great compromiser. This is often called the compromise tariff 1833. If you see on tests, it might be referred to as that. But in this compromise, he actually will have the tariff lowered until 1842 when it's zero. He presents that as an alternative, and South Carolina jumps on it. Because what South Carolina realizes, oh no, we don't have help, we don't have support. We can't beat the federal government. We can't do this alone. But if we quit now, we're going to look like a bunch of idiots. So Henry Clay is actually keeping things together, as you see from that Spider-Man meme. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, as I like to refer to him as, offers this as a way for South Carolina to get out of the predicament they're in, and they jump at it right away. Like they were in a bad situation. Like the next step essentially was war, and they knew they would get destroyed. This gives them a chance to get out. So Henry Clay enters as what I call a great compromise. Again, same man who came up with the compromise, Missouri Compromise in 1820, and he'll come in the picture again later. Now, Jackson's Indian policy. Now, this is the Indian Removal Act was an act of Congress. They had what they called a land exchange. They didn't call it a removal act. They called it land exchange. Native Americans would give up their lands on this side of Mississippi for lands in what they call Indian territory, and they would be squared off in those lands, and they would be free to roam this whole area. It would be theirs, but it would get them away from civilization. And they argue this was for their own benefit. Keep in mind, in Georgia especially, there was gold in these hills that they were starting to find, gold and silver actually. And so people wanted that land, and that was a big, big issue for the state of Georgia. But there's more than just a Cherokee. We talk about Cherokee and Trail of Tears. That's what this is obviously leading up to. Many of you guys remember this or know this already. But and the blues actually Cherokee who march up north for 800 miles. Those it affected all these Native Americans from different areas, even Seminole down in Florida. But those were the most interesting ones because they had already essentially what Jackson would call civilized themselves in the matter that they adopted Christianity. They even had a constitution of their own written up as the Cherokee nation in Georgia. They had a newspaper. They spoke English. They dressed American. They farmed. They abide by the same rules. You would not even think that they were Native Americans, except you had to look at them and see that. So this was a different case. Essentially, when this happens, it's Georgia who is going to enforce this. And there's actually two court cases. One's in 1830, and the next one's 1832. This is a big one. John Marshall is going to look at this and he said, hey, the Cherokee Nation is entitled to federal protection over those of the state laws of Georgia. So Georgia's made these state laws to remove them, but they can't. According to 1830 ruling, they also said that the Cherokee of Georgia were an independent nation. They had already had a treaty with the United States government before, right? Not all these Native Americans had some treaty at some point, right? And so as the Cherokee Nation, they were an independent nation within the United States. And thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, states, according to the Constitution, cannot negotiate treaties with other nations. Think about that. You don't want Texas negotiating a treaty with France, and meanwhile everybody else like, dude, no, we hate France. That wouldn't work, right? So states don't have that right, and Georgia, in doing that, was violating that right, or was violating the Constitution. John Marshall rules that. And even on this picture on the left, you can see the Indian reservations now. Even after years later, after they give them the Indian territory of Oklahoma, the U.S. government will push them even farther out to other areas nobody wants, because eventually Oklahoma was part of the Great Plains, and they wanted people there. Most reservations are in desert areas, very poor areas, very difficult to make a child living at. So this was just one of the many infractions of moving mass amounts of people. And so, having said that, so you're thinking, okay, in Worcester versus Georgia, he rules. John Marshall, Supreme Court says they're an independent nation. This is unconstitutional. You can't do this. What do you think Andrew Jackson's reaction is? Remember, he said must enforce the laws. You have to enforce these laws. He said that quote. He was referring to South Carolina, but he did say that. So you would think he would enforce the laws as president of the United States. It's his only job as executive office is to execute laws. His famous quote is, John Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. Showing the hypocrisy of Andrew Jackson. This is why you can't say he was really constitutional, because his only job was to execute the laws. And so he should not allow it to happen. But he's going to ignore it and say, it can happen. I don't care. Having said that, you think, all right, well, how did this eventually happen? Eventually, some Cherokee, a handful of Cherokee led by one man, was signing a treaty with Georgia and the United States government. And almost all the other Cherokees disagreed. They didn't agree to this at all. They didn't want this. But the U.S. government says, he represents the Cherokee Nation. It's fine. Good. We'll take it. The Cherokee will lose over 9,000 people on this 800-mile march. And I'll stop right now because I'm going to show you a video that puts Jackson on trial for this and many other things in his presidential career.
A national hero or public enemy number one? Historical figures are often controversial, but few were as deified or vilified in their lifetime as the 7th President of the United States. This is History versus Andrew Jackson.
Order. What were we? Yes. Mr. Jackson, you stand accused of degrading the office of the presidency, causing financial collapse, and wanton cruelty against American Indians. How do you plead?
Now, Your Honor, I am not a big city lawyer, but I do know a few things. And I know that President Jackson was a self-made frontiersman, a great general, a real man of the people. Your Honor, this man of the people was a gambler, a drunk, and a brawler. Why, I've heard it said that he would fight at the drop of a hat and then drop the hat himself. I ask you, was such a man fit for the most distinguished office in the nation? Can we forget the debacle of his inauguration? Who ever heard of inviting a drunken mob into the White House? It took ages to get the upholstery clean. That drunken mob, sir, was the American people, and they deserve to celebrate their victory.
Order. Now, did this celebration have pie?
Very well. Mr. Jackson, is it not the case that immediately upon assuming office, you introduced the spoils system, replacing hundreds of perfectly good federal employees with incompetent party loyalists? Your Honor, the president did no such thing. He tried to institute rotation in office to avoid any profiteering or funny business. It was the rest of the party who insisted on giving posts to their lackeys. But Mr. Jackson complied, did he not? Now, see here. Moving on. Mr. Jackson, did you not help to cause the financial panic of 1837 and the ensuing economic depression with your obsessive war against the Bank of the United States? Was not vetoing its reauthorization, as you did in 1832, an act of irresponsible populist pandering that made no economic sense? Your Honor, the gentleman has quite the imagination. That bank was just a way for rich Yanks to get richer. And all that money panic was caused when British banks raised interest rates and cut lending. To blame it on the president is preposterous, I say. But if Mr. Jackson had not destroyed the national bank, it would have been able to lend to farmers and businesses when other credit dried up, would it not?
This is all highly speculative. Can we move on?
Certainly, Your Honor. We now come to Mr. Jackson's most terrible offense, forcing entire tribes out of their native lands via the Indian Removal Act. I resent that accusation, sir. The U.S. of A. bought that land from the Indians fair and square. Do you call coercion and threats by a nation with a far more powerful army fair and square? Or signing a treaty for removing the Cherokee with a small group that didn't include their actual leaders? They didn't even have time to properly supply themselves before the army came and forced them to march the Trail of Tears. Now hold on a minute. This was all Van Buren's doing after President Jackson left office. But Mr. Jackson laid the groundwork and made sure the treaty was ratified. All President Van Buren had to do afterwards was enforce it. Look here, Your Honor. Our government's been purchasing Indian land since the beginning, and my client was negotiating these deals even before he was president. President Jackson truly believed it was best for the Indians to get compensated for their land and move out west, where there was plenty of space for them to keep living the way they were accustomed, rather than stick around and keep butting heads with the white settlers, some of whom, I remind our court, wanted to exterminate them outright. It was a different time. And yet, even in this different time, there were many in Congress and even the Supreme Court who saw how wrong the Removal Act was and loudly opposed it, were there not? My client was under a great deal of pressure. I say, do you think it's easy governing such a huge country and keeping the Union together when states are fixing to nullify federal laws? President Jackson barely got South Carolina to back down over those import tariffs. And then Georgia had to go discover gold and start grabbing up Cherokee land. It was either get the Indians to move or get in another fight with the state government. So you admit that Mr. Jackson sacrificed moral principles to achieve some political goals? I do declare, show me one leader who hasn't. As societies change and morals evolve, yesterday's hero may become tomorrow's villain, or vice versa. History may be past, but our understanding of it is always on trial.
So that video actually presents a good question that we have to ask ourselves: is how do we judge the people of the past? And I think that's something we're grappling with as a nation even now when we look back at our founding fathers. Do we judge them in that time period or looking back? That's up to you. But that is all true. That's an excellent TED Ed that really demonstrates how history should judge Jackson, and that's a massive debate we could have many times over. Now, the bank controversy. So you met his his Native American issues, his bank controversy. He hates the national bank. He's very much like Jefferson in this concept. Now you're thinking, okay, well, after the War of 1812, everybody realizes it's important. You had to have a national bank, and you're right. Democrat Republicans did. But as they leaned more towards a strong central government, there were some Democrat Republicans that did not feel that way. Remember I talked about how the farmers blamed the national bank for that panic of 1819. So it was a growing number of people within the Democrat Party that did not agree with the bank whatsoever. And there were some that felt it was needed. Jackson was one of those guys that hated it, despised it. He despised banks in general. Now, if you're thinking, okay, well, what can he do as president? Well, the second national bank was on a charter just like the first national bank, in that it's a 20-year charter. And after 20 years up, Congress would vote to renew it. If not, it would fall apart and end, just like the first national bank, right? So in 1816, shortly after the War of 1812, the American government did just that. They had chartered a bank for 20 years, which means it ends in 1836. Now, supporters of the bank realized, hey, if we wait until 1836 and Jackson's president still, all right, if he wins his re-election in 32, in 36, he's going to veto it because he has nothing to lose. But if we do it now, if we put this legislation in place now, 1832, right before his election, he'll have to sign it. It'll be too controversy for him not to sign it. So our best bet to get this done isn't wait till 1836, because if he's president, he's going to veto it in 1836. He's on his way out. He's got no reason not to. It's his second term. But if we do it now before his reelection, guarantee you he has to sign it, right? He's not going to he's not going to veto that and at the bank end. He would never do that. That would piss off too many people, even his own party. But Andrew Jackson is very unpredictable. And as you see from this slide, he does that. He will veto it. And again, you can see why he's been named even by his own people, King George. He just vetoes anything he doesn't agree with. He uses the veto power quite a bit. The top right side of your screen, that cartoon, is Andrew Jackson battling the Hydra-headed Bank of the United States, and that's why he referred to the national bank. Hydra-headed monster is what he often called it, and he always wanted to get rid of it. So in this sense, he can't get rid of it, but he refuses to renew it. So he's got that done. And now he's running for election, and you're thinking, oh, that killed him. There's no way he's going to get reelected. And take a look at this map. In 1832, there's a couple big firsts. First, he had a first presidential election to have a third-party candidate. That third party was the Anti-Masonic Party. You guys ever heard of the Freemasons, right? But the Freemasons have been around. At this point in time, people have known about them. It's pretty public. There was a gentleman in New York who has said he was to come forth about and spill all the rumors of all the secrets of the Freemasons. He's mysteriously thrown in jail by local police officers thought to be Freemasons. He mysteriously disappears and never seen from again from that jail cell. So it created a whole conspiracy theory of its own time, and people started growing and fearing this Mason party. And so this third party, actually, the first third party in American history was an anti-Mason party. It was a Masonic party. It was a conspiracy theorist. So looking back now, we shouldn't be surprised that these guys exist. Like, it's been here for a while. We never quite actually know how to deal with them. So also, it's the first national election to have a nominating convention. See, Republicans and the people who have learned, let me second, what they call themselves the National Republicans, John Quincy Adams people, they realize, hey, we have to have one person and we can't split the votes. That's going to screw us up. So they're going to have primaries in states, have a convention, and pick one guy, and National Republicans are Henry Clay. And then we have the Democrat Republicans. From now on, I'm going to refer to them just as Democrats because it's going to be easier for you. The Democrats are going to pick Jackson for another term. And from this, you can see Jackson easily wins, right? He gets more of the popular vote. Not a whole bunch more, but just enough to edge by. The other states are split. The popular vote split a lot will actually go to the anti-Masonic party, the conspiracy theory party, 20% of the popular vote. And that's going to screw up the electoral vote. And you're thinking, how does that screw it up? Well, keep in mind, say here, Kentucky votes for Henry Clay, the National Republican. What if the surrounding area, like half of Ohio, half of Virginia, part of North Carolina, part of Tennessee, half of Tennessee, what if half of them actually vote for Henry Clay? Well, it doesn't matter if 51% of them, Virginians, voted for Jackson, then the whole state goes to Jackson. All 23 electoral votes go to Jackson. You can see the big problem with the Electoral College in general, how it never truly represents the popular vote. As we saw in 2016, over 3 million Americans actually voted for Hillary Clinton. 3 million more voted for Hillary Clinton, but the way the Electoral College works is Trump was able to squeeze by and get certain states. Now people are going to argue, oh, those 3 million are in California. California was the last state to submit its numbers because it's at the end of the coast, at the end of America. So it's a time difference. That's why they're the last one to do it. It could be 3 million in general, right? So you can see the problem with the Electoral College is a perfect example. If 49% of Virginia also voted for Henry Clay, doesn't matter. 51% voted for Jackson, so Jackson gets all 23 votes. It's the big issue we have with the Electoral College in general. It's not the first time we see that issue, but nonetheless, Jackson is going to win the re-election, and in doing so, he feels empowered to continue his idea. And the big thing here is the bank. He can't legally disband the Second National Bank. I mean, it's chartered by Congress. He can't just get rid of it. So he starts to pretty much tear it apart slowly by slowly. He stops all deposits. Okay, and then he's going to spend all the money that's in the bank. Any more incoming money, he's going to redirect and send it to pet banks, which are pretty much his favorite state banks. Now, here's the problem. Those state banks are going to take all that extra money and start making more loans, more loans, more loans. More loans are out there. More farmers take those loans and buy land. The more people buying land, the less land, and the more prices go up. They create land speculation. And speculation is that idea where people will buy land and try to resell it later for more. Stock speculation, people buy stock low and try to sell it for high. Real estate speculation is part of U.S. history. It's happening quite a bit, even before this. But the states are going to do that. And they make all these loans, and they create essentially what's land speculation. And it's really expensive, so much that the common man can't even afford the land anymore. And that's Jackson's greatest fear. He did not want that to happen, but of course the banks are going to do that. Of course, why wouldn't the bank? They make money off the loans. They make interest. That's what they do. Okay. In the right there, that's actually the picture of Second National Bank, the building. If it looks deserted, it is. If you go to Philadelphia, they've got like boards on windows where they've been broken. Nobody really knows what to do with the building. I mean, it's a historical building, but what do you do with it? So it's actually not too far from center of Philadelphia, near Independence Hall. But if you've ever been to Philadelphia, you'll see nice area, dirty, poor area, Independence Hall, ghetto. You see all kinds of stuff. So it's pretty interesting. Anyway, so other measures he takes financially. Jackson is worried about the money states are printing now and the loans they're making, and so he makes a executive order. Presidents have this power to make executive orders. As long as those laws they create by executive order is constitutional, it's going to stay. As long as Congress doesn't pass a law to override it. A lot of people don't realize that. But every president has done executive orders, some in the hundreds, some in the thousands. And when they do so, they do it because Congress didn't pass a law. So, perfect example we think of is DACA or DAPA. Both were executive orders signed by Obama. President Obama did this, and some people were furious, and they said, "This is tyranny. You're just passing these laws." And the reaction was to President Obama was like, "Hey, Congress won't pass a law to give to a pathway to citizenship. The pathway to citizenship has not been adjusted since 1960. It needs to be fixed. They won't do this, and that's because Republicans, his opponents, control the House and the Senate, and they won't even put this law up for debate." He goes, and his argument was the same as every president made executive order. All Congress has to do is make a law, and it overrides the executive order just like that. But they didn't. Instead, they argue it's unconstitutional, and judges will put a hold on it. With DAPA, they put a hold on it. With DACA, it took President Trump's administration trying to get rid of it. And in a famous case, one judge keeps DACA for the time being. And Trump has actually done quite a few refusing to do things with that. So executive orders go all the way back to George Washington. Obama does it. People were furious that Obama was doing it. My dad's, for example, can't believe Obama's doing it. I said, "Dad, every president's done it." He goes, "Yeah, it needs to stop." But then Trump became president. It was a great thing. It's okay to do it. It's politics is what people believe. It's horrible. So Andrew Jackson isn't crazy for doing this. His executive order is completely legal. His use of executive order ends up causing a panic. It can all be traced back to this executive order, the Specie Circular. Essentially, what it was, executive order that said all government land, if it's to be sold, it has to be paid for in gold or silver. Okay, his worry was actually legitimate. It was that, hey, state banks are printing money, is the money going to be worth it? But the problem is, common farmers don't have gold. The common man doesn't have gold or silver or anything like that. Only wealthy land spectators who are going to buy land and try to sell it for more later have gold and silver. So this is the beginning of it. By this executive order, Specie Circular, saying, hey, you have to have everything in gold or silver, it's going to cause the next panic of 1837. It starts with this, right? And it continues on when Americans, with this next scenario that takes place. Okay? Because at the same time, Americans are buying credit, using credit to buy stuff from Great Britain. And not just Americans, but other countries like China as well. Everybody's using credit to buy from Great Britain. Great Britain, their banks have a collapse, sort of. And so they're not taking credit anymore. They want gold and silver to pay for everything. Well, it wasn't a problem at first for America because lots of countries are investing their gold in America. England, France, Mexico, and others, plenty of others, are investing gold and silver in America. If you're wondering why, that's come back to our history. We have very stable governments. Even at the time, it was pretty stable. There wasn't worries about it. It was far away from Europe, so you didn't have to worry about losing it in a war, somebody taking it, or a government over getting thrown, like in France, that kept happening. The United States was a safe place to invest your money, especially gold. But once Great Britain had an economic slowdown and the banks collapsed and they began to only accept gold as currency, when we say hard currency, that's what hard currency means. No paper, paper soft, right? That's soft currency. Hard currency, gold and silver. Foreign investors pulled all the gold out of America because they had to pay Great Britain for goods. So France and Mexico and other countries pull their gold and silver out of America so they could pay Great Britain. Great Britain went through an own economic term, so downturn. So they're going to pull their gold out. So there's less gold in America, and that's the only payment that government land sales will take. So there's a shortage of gold and silver. Things get really bad because now you don't have gold and silver to back your banknotes. Your banknotes are useless. Nobody can buy land. They don't have gold and silver. There's no credit in America because there's no gold in America. So banks can't let out any more loans. Business begin to fail. Unemployment's rise in the city. This is your Panic of 1837. That's how one executive order leads to the Panic of 1837. And there's even books written about it. That's pretty interesting how that actually occurs. And how it actually comes down to one executive order that decides that. Now, so if you're thinking, okay, Jackson, it's his end of his second term. It's all over. Nobody's going to ever support him. The people blamed this panic on the bank, not Jackson. Jackson still has his loyalist people, and they're going to blame it on the bank. Now, that's a common man. There are politicians who know better. Jackson now has angered more people than before, even his own Democrat Party. As a matter of fact, 41 Democrats who did vote for a national bank, who didn't side with Jackson, who wanted a national bank, who realized it was necessary, 28 are going to quit the Democrats and become Whigs, including his lifelong friend, David Crockett, that you guys all know goes all the way back to War of 1812. Even he quit being a Democrat and became a Whig. They hated King Andrew, and they called his followers Tories. That goes back to American Revolution. Remember, loyalists were called Tories. So King Andrew and his Tories, that's what they called those who did whatever King Andrew said. And so essentially you have this other party forming. They were the Republicans, National Republicans. They become the Whigs as all these groups come together. It's more of a coalition. I have that on the bottom there, a coalition of Whigs. They call themselves the Whigs because to them, they were opposites. They were rebelling against King Andrew. And so they're the Patriots. And so like the American Revolution, the nickname for American Patriots were Whigs. So they consist of Whigs and King Andrew against King Andrew and his loyalist Tories, right? The Whig coalition were all opponents of Jackson. They supported eternal improvements. They wanted roads, railroads built, and they wanted government to pay for this. This got the farmers in the West behind the Whigs. A national bank, like I said, a lot of Democrats actually left. Out of 41 who voted for, 28 gave up on Democrats and became Whigs. So even in the South, urban banking wanted this national government. They realized the need for this. Whigs wanted high tariffs to protect manufacturing, so factory owners, factory workers like that. And then the Whigs even went on a little bit different path. It wasn't just economical; it was social issues. Abortion and temperance were moving up. There were people that didn't abolition, ending slavery and ending liquor. Temperance is actually making alcohol illegal. Those issues begin to arise, and the Whigs take a hold of that and say, "Hey, we're going to take a stand on this. We agree we should end slavery. We should end alcohol." And this is mainly native-born peoples of America, or Protestants in general, British American Protestants, those who were pushing for change, social reform changes like ending slavery and temperance. So the Whig coalition consists of a whole bunch of people and tied a whole bunch of people together to confront the Democrats. So national Republicans are dead. We now have the Whigs versus the Democrats. And this is the same Democrat Party we have today. Now, yeah, it's changed quite a bit in the past 160 years, right? Obviously, from this even to civil rights and everything, right? Democrats have changed quite a bit. But these are Democrats we have today. The Whig Party will later on was split. But for a short time period, we do have the Whigs versus the Democrats. Democrats are going to choose Martin Van Buren. As we know, pretty much Andrew Jackson is shaping this man up to be the next president. He says, "This is my guy. I'm going to go with him." Martin Van Buren has been my vice president for the past 4 years. He's great. He's wonderful. This was all planned out. The Whigs could not pick one person. They did not have a primary. They did not pick one guy. You can see how it's spread out quite a bit. Harrison's going to get near his home state, near Ohio, India, Kentucky. White, a Whig, he's going to get Tennessee, Georgia. Webster will get a couple of votes as well. Independent South Carolina. This is a terror of people, state rights people. There's the butthole of South Carolina is still there. They still are trying hard. They're unreal. But because they split so much, imagine New York. You could have we could have 40% of New York people actually voting for Martin Van Buren, but the other 60% it's split among all these guys. Van Buren gets a majority, so all New York goes. That's what happens when we have third parties. It changes everything. In this case, you don't have a third party. You have a whole bunch of guys running. It's a horrible idea. That's why we've developed a two-party system today. All these mistakes have been learned. So in 1836, you do have this man with the long sideburns, the chops there, and bald head, Martin Van Buren, nicknamed the Little Magician, mainly because he was his whole life as a lawyer and politician. And every time he was a politician, he always came out on the right side of things. He avoided all political controversy. He worked his way up through political. He was always on the perfect winning side. So he was nicknamed the Little Magician as one of his nicknames. He had a couple of nicknames, but the Little Magician for that. Somehow he was always on the right side and eventually became president. Now that is a dark contrast because I want you to remember this guy is not representing the working man if he's a lawyer and politician, right? You got to wonder how he just won over Jackson so well. Again, the Little Magician. It's a perfect name for this guy. All right. Now, by this time, he takes office in 1837. He takes office, of course, in March of 37. Panic is pretty bad. It's widespread. Again, to recap, Great Britain had their depression. They invest less in the U.S. They require gold. There's less money in the U.S. Less currency in the U.S. means banks fail. 40% of banks crash. Businesses crash as well. 90% of factories in 1837 closed. Unemployment was over 30%. Unemployment during that Great Recession, 08, just so you understand, in Texas never got above 10%. Most places in the United States never got above 10%. And we talk about how bad the recession was recently. Even with the Great Depression, 25%. The panic of 1837, 30% of unemployed people. It got so bad, hungry crowds were breaking into warehouses for food. You don't hear about this a lot, but this was pretty bad. The panic of 1837 was pretty bad. Van Buren does have a plan. He doesn't agree with the National Bank. Again, he's just like Jackson. That he's going to call for an independent treasury. The government will control its own funds. They have a whole system set up. It wouldn't be like the National Bank, where it's partly privately controlled by investors, partially controlled by the government. That's the way national banks worked. It's kind of not 50-50, but it's close to that. Private investors had an influence on how the governments spent their money. He goes, we don't need that. We need an independent treasury. And to be honest, it does get through Congress. It gets approved, but it takes forever to get it through. It's actually 1840 before it gets approved. And then next year, 1841, a new Congress comes in and they repeal it. He's elected in 1836 because election year is in 1840. He leaves office in 1841. So I'm kind of foreshadowing what happens to the campaign of 1840. Election of 1840 is an interesting campaign. It's pretty cool, pretty funny. The Whigs put together William Henry Harrison. He's an old man. He served in the War of 1812. He goes far back. He was a general at the time, so was his father. Democrats made fun of this Whig. The Democrats said he was a man that would rather spend his days, old man, sitting in front of his log cabin and drinking hard cider. Or sitting in his log cabin drinking hard cider. He's an old man. If you don't know anything about this back then, hard cider was a type of wheat-based alcohol, kind of like beer, a little bit stronger. But nonetheless, they were making fun of him. He's an old man, sits at home and drinks hard cider. Who is he? Well, that backfired on Democrats. Because ask yourself this question. Who looks like they represent the common man? Van Buren, a lawyer and politician his whole life. Or the guy that likes to sit in a log cabin and drink hard cider. If you're the common man, you're going to kind of lean towards Harrison. And in fact, Harrison's campaign was so great about this. They actually went around carrying log cabins, like 4 feet size miniature log cabins, and giving out hard cider as part of the campaign. It's a pretty interesting campaign if you look at 1840. But nonetheless, it backfires on the Whigs. And Martin Van Buren, as you know from this map, will be a one-term president. Now, that usually happens when you have a panic. It's hard to combat that, so you get blamed for it. You can see in the popular vote never represents the electoral vote again. He only gets 60, but he did get a huge portion. I'll always argue 40% of Americans will vote one political party, 40% vote the other one at least. You're just trying to get those middle ones to change. That's my argument. And that, if you look at the popular vote, it feels like that's usually the case. So if we look back, looking at Jackson's years, if we look back at it, there are a few things we do to address. Jackson does bring back this whole Jeffersonian approach of a centralized government, of a federal government. And that is an approach where the federal government does as little as possible, limit what they can do. Jackson brings that Jeffersonian ideal back. After Jefferson, you had Madison in War of 1812, and everybody agreed you need a bigger federal government because of War of 1812. Here we have early 1830s. Jackson's going to say, no, we need a Jeffersonian idea. So he brings that back. Now you can debate if Jackson's a great president, bad president. It's up to you. It's hard. That's not fact. When you say great or worse, that's not fact. It's hard to actually go through. But one fact you can't ignore is that while Jackson's president, the number of voters, eligible voters, tripled, right? States were dropping property requirements, they're dropping tax requirements, especially if the state, and the states knew this, a state, if they're like, hey, most of our people don't own property that would vote for me, I need to get rid of that law or rule so that I can get more votes. That happened. But an indirect result was that voting, people who were eligible to vote tripled. So America was actually becoming more and more of a democracy. Granted, it's white male, it's only white males, but it is the beginning of actual true democracy, not just elitists, not just elite controlling. Jackson represented the common man. So it felt like things could and would change. That actually summarizes chapter 10.